Rome did not begin as a dream of greatness. It began as a necessity. Between hostile hills and an unforgiving river, a small community learned early that survival required order, discipline, and obedience to something greater than individual desire. Where Greece questioned the universe, Rome organized it. Where philosophers debated truth, Romans demanded loyalty, duty, and law. Rome did not ask why the world should be ruled. It asked how. From mud brick huts beside the Tiber would rise a system that valued structure over inspiration, authority over imagination, and endurance over brilliance. Rome would borrow the gods of Greece, the tactics of its enemies, and the ideas of conquered peoples, then reshape them into something colder, harder, and more permanent. This is the story of a civilization that conquered not by believing itself divine, but by believing nothing was beyond control. An empire built on law, a republic undone by power, a world united damned, slowly hollowed from within. This is Rome. Chapter 1. Rome. From republic to dominion, Rome was born without prophecy. There was no promise that it would rule the world, no divine decree that placed destiny in its hands. Unlike Troy, unlike Athens, unlike the myth-soaked kingdoms of the East, Rome's origin was uncertain, contested, and deliberately practical. Even its founding legend, Romulus killing Remus, was not a tale of divine harmony, but of violence, rivalry, and law imposed through blood. From the beginning, Rome accepted a harsh truth. Power is not given. It is taken, organized, and defended. Nestled along the Tiber River, Rome's earliest citizens were farmers, shepherds, and warriors, surrounded by stronger neighbors. Survival demanded unity. Unity demanded rules, and rules demanded authority that could not be endlessly questioned. Where Greek city-states fractured over ideology, Rome learned early that disagreement, if left unchecked, was a weakness enemies could exploit. Thus emerged the Roman Republic, not as an experiment in freedom, but as a system designed to prevent chaos. The Republic divided power carefully, consuls to lead, a senate to deliberate, assemblies to legitimize decisions. No single man was meant to rule. Memory of kingship was bitter. Rome had expelled its monarchs and sworn never again to kneel before one ruler. Law, not bloodline, would govern the state. Yet beneath this balanced structure lay a deeper principle, the supremacy of the state over the individual. Roman virtue was not brilliance or originality. It was discipline, gravitas, pietas, duty to family, duty to ancestors, duty to Rome above all else. A citizen's worth was measured not by thought. The Republic did not ask its people to imagine a better world. It asked them to maintain this one at any cost. Expansion was not an ambition, it was a consequence. Each war Rome fought reshaped it. Each enemy defeated taught it something new. From the Etruscans, Rome learned urban planning and religious ritual. From the Greeks, it absorbed philosophy and art, though always with suspicion. From the Carthaginians, it mastered naval warfare through relentless adaptation. Rome did not innovate beautifully, it perfected ruthlessly. Victory brought territory. Territory brought wealth. Wealth brought inequality. As Rome grew, so did the distance between its ideals and its reality. Small farmers, the backbone of the Republic, were displaced by war and debt. Their land consolidated into vast estates worked by slaves captured in conquest. The Senate, once a body of shared responsibility, hardened into an aristocratic elite guarding its privileges. The Republic still spoke the language of balance, but power was no longer balanced. Into this tension stepped soldiers who owed their loyalty not to Rome, but to commanders who paid them. Generals became political forces. Armies became bargaining tools. The state that once feared kings now produced men whose ambition exceeded law. Gaius Marius reformed the army, opening it to the poor and, in doing so, bound soldiers to generals rather than institutions. Lucius Cornelius Sulla marched on Rome itself, proving that violence could rewrite law. Each precedent shattered another safeguard. The Republic survived these shocks, but it was changing. Politics became spectacle. Violence entered the forum. Assassination became strategy. Moral language remained, but its meaning hollowed out. The Senate defended tradition while undermining its spirit. Reformers spoke of justice while wielding mobs. Rome was no longer a city governed by law. It was a state governed by momentum. Julius Caesar understood this better than anyone. He was not the first ambitious Roman, but he was the first to combine military genius, political calculation, and mythic self-awareness. Caesar did not present himself as a tyrant. He framed himself as Rome's necessary solution. He crossed the Rubicon not as an act of rebellion, but as a declaration that the Republic could no longer govern itself. Civil war followed. It always does. When Caesar emerged victorious, Rome faced a contradiction it could not resolve. The man who saved the Republic had destroyed it. His assassination was meant to restore balance. Instead, it revealed the truth: the Republic was already dead. The knife strokes in the Senate were not a defense of liberty, but the final admission that law had lost authority over power. Out of the chaos rose Octavian, later Augustus. He did what Caesar could not. He ended the Republic without announcing its death. He preserved its language while emptying its substance. The Senate remained. Elections continued. Traditions were honored. But ultimate authority rested with one man, patient, disciplined, and absolute. Rome became an empire, not through conquest alone, but through acceptance. Peace followed. Stability returned. Roads connected continents. Law standardized life from Britain to Syria. The empire delivered order on a scale the ancient world had never known. For many, Rome's dominion felt like relief, but something had been traded. Citizens became subjects. Participation became obedience. The political energy that once fueled debate was redirected into spectacle and administration. Rome had conquered the world, but in doing so, it transformed itself into something heavier, slower, and more fragile than it appeared. The Republic had fallen not because it was weak, but because it succeeded too well. Its systems could not contain the power they unleashed. Rome now stood at the center of the world, and the world would shape Rome in return. Chapter 2: Rome. Law, order, and the architecture of control. Rome ruled longer than any empire of its scale, not because it inspired love, but because it engineered obedience. Where other powers relied on fear or divine legitimacy, Rome relied on something more durable: law made visible. From stone tablets in the Forum to roads stretching beyond the horizon, Rome did not merely command its structured life so thoroughly that resistance became impractical, even unthinkable. Law was Rome's true weapon. The Roman legal system was not built to express moral perfection. It was built to function. Clarity mattered more than compassion. Procedure mattered more than intent. A Roman did not ask whether a law was just in the abstract sense. He asked whether it was established, enforceable, and consistent with precedent. In this way, law became habit. Habit became order. Citizenship itself was legal architecture. To be Roman was not merely to be born within the city's walls. It was to exist within a defined set of rights and obligations. Citizenship could be expanded, restricted, or granted strategically. Conquered peoples were not always destroyed. They were categorized. Allies, subjects, non-citizens, slaves, each status carried precise legal meaning. Inclusion was conditional but powerful. Rome offered a path into its system, and many chose submission over annihilation. This flexibility allowed Rome to rule diversity without erasing it entirely. Yet inclusion came at a cost. To accept Roman law was to accept Roman authority. Local customs survived only insofar as they did not contradict imperial interest. Resistance was labeled not as dissent, but as disorder. Rebellion was not immoral, it was illegal. Order justified everything. Rome's physical landscape reinforced this principle. Cities across the empire were built to a recognizable pattern: forum, basilica, temple, bath, amphitheater. These were not mere amenities. They were instruments of control. The forum centralized commerce and judgment. The basilica embodied law. The bath cultivated routine and social hierarchy. The amphitheater transformed violence into ritualized entertainment. The empire did not hide power. It displayed it daily. Roads were the empire's veins, straight, durable, and mercilessly efficient. They allowed legions, administrators, and information to move faster than any rival. To travel a Roman road was to feel the presence of the state, even in distant provinces. Milestones marked not distance, but dominance. All roads did not simply lead to Rome, they returned to it. The army was law's final argument. Roman legions were disciplined beyond comparison, not because soldiers were fearless, but because disobedience was unbearable. Punishment was collective. Failure was shared. Loyalty was enforced through structure rather than charisma. A legionary learned early that survival depended on coordination, not heroism. War under Rome was not chaos, it was administration by other means. But the very efficiency that made Rome strong carried a hidden danger. As law expanded, moral responsibility diffused. Orders came from distant authorities. Decisions were justified by procedure. Atrocities became paperwork. When cruelty was embedded in systems, no single hand could be blamed. The empire functioned because individuals surrendered judgment to institutions. This surrender reshaped Roman identity. The citizen soldier of the Republic gave way to the professional administrator of the empire. Politics receded from daily life. Participation was replaced by compliance. Stability was valued above all else, even truth. As long as roads were safe and grain arrived on time, questions of legitimacy faded. Peace in Rome was silence. Yet beneath this silence, contradictions accumulated. Law promised universality, but enforced hierarchy. Order required obedience, but obedience eroded civic virtue. The empire expanded rights, even as it narrowed political voice. Rome claimed to civilize the world, but it did so by standardizing humanity. The empire had mastered control. What it had not mastered was meaning. As generations passed, Rome's subjects lived longer, safer, and more predictable lives than most humans before them. But predictability bred emptiness. Law organized bodies, not souls. Ritual maintained order, not belief. Beneath marble temples and iron discipline, a quiet question spread. What does obedience serve when purpose is absent? Rome had built the strongest system the ancient world had ever seen. Now it would face its most dangerous challenge, not invasion, but doubt. Chapter 3. Rome bred spectacle and the management of the masses. Rome learned early that control could not rely on law alone. Law disciplined behavior, but it did not soothe hunger, resentment, or fear. An empire of millions, spread across cultures, languages, and histories, required something more subtle. Distraction without chaos, satisfaction without empowerment. Rome found its solution not in philosophy, but in ritualized pleasure. The masses did not need a voice, they needed to be occupied. Grain was the first instrument. As Rome expanded, it bound distant provinces to the capital through food supply. Egypt's harvests fed Rome's streets. North Africa became a granary for the empire. The flow of grain was not charity, it was insurance. A fed population was less likely to riot, less likely to question, and more likely to accept authority as long as survival was guaranteed. Bread created dependence, but dependence alone was fragile. It required reinforcement. That reinforcement came in the form of spectacle. The amphitheater was Rome's most honest institution. Here, violence was no longer random or political, it was theatrical. Gladiators fought not as rebels, but as performers. Death became predictable, scheduled, and framed as entertainment. The crowd learned to associate power with control over life and death, exercised calmly and publicly by the state. In the arena, Rome taught its people a lesson. Suffering is normal, hierarchy is natural, and mercy is optional. Games were not merely entertainment, they were political currency. Emperors and elites funded spectacles to secure loyalty. The louder the crowd roared, the more legitimate power felt. Public emotion was redirected away from policy and toward performance. Anger found release in cheers. Frustration dissolved into ritual bloodshed. Spectacle replaced participation. Religion followed the same logic. Traditional Roman gods were practical, contractual, and civic. Sacrifice ensured stability. Ritual maintained order. Faith was less about belief than continuity. As long as ceremonies were observed, the gods were satisfied, or so Rome claimed. But as the empire expanded, belief diversified. Eastern cults, mystery religions, and philosophies flowed into Roman cities. They promised personal meaning, salvation, or transcendence, things Roman civic religion never offered. The state tolerated these beliefs as long as they did not disrupt loyalty. Spiritual diversity was acceptable. Political disobedience was not. This tolerance had limits. Any movement that rejected Roman authority outright was seen not as heresy, but as treason. The empire could accept new gods. It could not accept refusal to worship power itself. Loyalty rituals mattered more than belief. To refuse was to step outside the system. Thus, even faith became a tool of governance. The population adapted. Citizens learned to separate private thought from public behavior. One could doubt inwardly, but comply outwardly. This quiet division preserved peace, but hollowed integrity. Over time, conformity became second nature. Rome did not demand love-only routine. Yet the strategy carried an unintended consequence. When life is reduced to survival and spectacle, ambition changes shape. Greatness no longer meant service or virtue. It meant visibility. Fame replaced honor. Crowds elevated performers, athletes, and entertainers above statesmen. Power shifted toward those who could command attention rather than govern wisely. The empire was stable, but it was shallow. Bread dulled urgency. Games normalized cruelty. Religion lost depth. Politics became distant. The Roman citizen was safe, but disengaged. And disengagement is not neutrality, it is surrender. Rome had mastered the art of keeping people alive and distracted. What it had not solved was how to keep them invested in anything beyond themselves. Chapter 4. Rome. Power without purpose. Rome possessed everything an empire could desire. Territory stretched from mist-covered islands in the north to burning deserts in the south. Trade flowed along secure roads and sea lanes. Law standardized life. Armies deterred rebellion. Spectacle calmed the masses. By every measurable standard, Rome had succeeded. Yet, success created a dangerous illusion that stability was the same as meaning. The empire no longer asked what it existed to become. It focused only on what it needed to maintain. Emperors ruled not as visionaries, but as managers of continuity. Their primary task was not transformation, but preservation of borders, revenue, and order. Innovation was risky. Reform threatened balance. Tradition, even when hollow, felt safer than change. Power became cautious. This caution did not weaken Rome immediately. It made it rigid. Systems optimized for control resisted adaptation. Decisions were justified by precedent rather than necessity. When circumstances shifted, Rome responded slowly, often too late. The imperial court reflected this stagnation. Access to the emperor became a currency more valuable than merit. Advisors competed not to offer truth, but to secure favor. Flattery replaced counsel. Information became filtered, shaped to protect those closest to power. The emperor, surrounded by reassurance, governed an empire he increasingly misunderstood. Distance eroded reality. Provincial governors ruled vast territories with limited oversight. Some governed competently, others exploited their authority. Corruption flourished, not because Rome lacked law, but because enforcement weakened as power spread thin. The farther one traveled from the capital, the more abstract Rome became. Loyalty shifted from ideals to individuals. When emperors were strong, the system held. When they were weak, ambition filled the vacuum. Succession became Rome's most dangerous vulnerability. There was no stable mechanism for transfer of power, only adoption, force, or conspiracy. Each transition risked civil war. Violence was no longer external, it was internal. As Rome aged, its citizens felt the change. The sense of collective destiny faded. Military service became a career, not a calling. Public life felt distant. The empire provided safety, but demanded little beyond compliance and taxes. In return, citizens offered indifference. Indifference is corrosive. Without shared purpose, power became self-referential. Authority existed to preserve authority. Laws protected systems, not values. Ritual continued, but belief thinned. Rome still spoke the language of greatness, but no longer remembered what greatness meant. Philosophies of resignation spread. Stoicism taught endurance, not transformation. It offered inner peace in exchange for acceptance of an unchangeable world. This was not rebellion, it was retreat. The empire did not collapse into chaos, it settled into inertia. Rome's greatest strength, its capacity to endure, became its quiet undoing. By surviving everything, it postponed renewal. By absorbing every challenge, it delayed reckoning. The empire became vast, old, and tired. Power remained, purpose did not. The world Rome ruled was changing. New beliefs were forming. New peoples were moving. New pressures gathered at the edges of its borders and within its cities. Rome stood unchallenged, yet unprepared. Chapter 5. Rome. Faith against the empire. Rome could conquer lands, discipline bodies, and regulate behavior. What it could not fully control was belief. For centuries, Roman religion had been civic rather than spiritual. Gods were guardians of order, not sources of personal transformation. Ritual mattered more than conviction. As long as sacrifices were performed and festivals observed, the system functioned. Faith supported stability. It did not challenge authority. But the empire's vastness changed the nature of belief. As Rome absorbed the Mediterranean world, it inherited not only territories, but anxieties. In crowded cities and restless provinces, people sought answers. Law could not provide questions of suffering, injustice, death, and meaning. Traditional Roman rituals offered no comfort. They maintained order, but did not heal the soul. Into this void entered new faiths. Mystery cults promised salvation beyond the state. Eastern religions spoke of rebirth, cosmic justice, and personal redemption. Philosophies offered inner freedom in a world where external freedom had vanished. These movements did not reject Rome outright, but they shifted loyalty inward. The most disruptive among them was Christianity. At first, it appeared insignificant, a small, persecuted sect originating in a distant province. It possessed no army, no wealth, no political ambition, yet it carried something Rome could not tolerate: exclusive allegiance. Christians refused to worship the emperor, not out of rebellion, but conviction. They obeyed laws, paid taxes, and served communities, yet denied the state's spiritual authority. This distinction terrified Rome. Rome understood dissent as disobedience. Christianity offered something more dangerous: moral independence. Believers claimed loyalty to a higher law that judged all earthly power. In doing so, they exposed the empire's greatest weakness: its demand for total legitimacy. Persecution followed, not constantly, but cyclically. Martyrdom was meant to deter. Instead, it inspired. Public executions turned faith into spectacle, and spectacle into testimony. Where Rome sought silence, it created narrative. Where it sought obedience, it revealed fear. The more the empire punished belief, the more belief hardened. Rome faced a paradox. It could not destroy Christianity without abandoning its own legal principles. It could not tolerate Christianity without undermining imperial authority. Each response weakened something essential. Eventually, Rome adapted. Under Constantine, Christianity was legalized, then favored. The empire attempted to absorb the faith rather than erase it. Bishops gained influence, doctrine intertwined with law. The cross rose beside the eagle. This solved one problem and created another. By embracing Christianity, Rome acknowledged that power alone was insufficient. It admitted the need for moral legitimacy. But faith transformed by empire is never the same. What began as resistance became institution. What challenged authority learned to wield it. The state survived. Its meaning shifted. Christianity offered Rome a renewed sense of purpose, but also divided it. Doctrinal conflicts fractured unity. Authority now competed not only with ambition, but with interpretation of truth itself. The empire gained a soul but lost coherence. Rome had finally met a force it could not simply manage. Belief had entered history as a rival to power. Chapter 6: Rome, Barbarians, Borders, and the Myth of Invasion. Rome did not fall because it was suddenly overwhelmed. It fell because the world around it changed, and Rome misunderstood that change. For centuries, the empire had defined itself against the barbarian peoples beyond its borders, ungoverned by Roman law, speaking unfamiliar languages, living without cities or written codes. To Rome, they represented chaos and external threat that justified walls, legions, and discipline. But the barbarians were not always enemies. They were traders, migrants, allies, and soldiers. Long before Rome's decline, barbarians served in Roman armies, guarded frontiers, and adopted Roman customs. They admired Rome even as they stood outside it. The border was not a line, it was a zone of exchange. Rome's mistake was believing the frontier was static. As climate shifts, population pressures, and conflicts in distant regions intensified, entire peoples began moving not to destroy Rome, but to enter it. They sought land, security, and inclusion within the imperial system. They wanted Rome's protection, not its ruin. The empire hesitated. Inclusion required flexibility. Flexibility threatened identity. Roman authorities alternated between acceptance and exclusion, often within the same generation. Some groups were settled peacefully. Others were exploited, starved, or betrayed. Promises were broken. Resentment followed. Violence was not inevitable. It was manufactured by mismanagement. When borders failed, Rome responded, as it always had, with force. But force without integration solved nothing. Each suppressed revolt produced hardened enemies. Each rejected group returned larger, angrier, and more organized. The legions themselves had changed. Increasingly composed of non-Roman recruits, the army remained disciplined but detached from the empire's core. Soldiers fought for pay and survival, not for an idea of Rome they no longer shared. Loyalty became transactional. Commanders with resources commanded allegiance more than emperors with titles. The myth of invasion obscured a deeper truth. Rome was not conquered by outsiders alone. It was transformed by them. The empire lacked a coherent strategy for absorbing difference at scale. Its systems had been designed for expansion, not migration, for dominance, not coexistence. As pressure mounted, borders hardened, symbolically but weakened functionally. Walls rose, laws tightened, citizenship narrowed. The empire retreated into definitions of purity it had never truly possessed. Fear replaced confidence. The sack of Rome shocked the ancient world, not because of its destruction, but because of its symbolism. The eternal city had proven mortal. Authority felt fragile. Once fear entered the imperial imagination, decline accelerated. Rome still existed, but belief in its permanence did not. The barbarians did not end Rome. Rome ended the world that made Rome possible. Chapter 7: Rome, an empire that outlived itself. Rome did not collapse in a single moment. It lingered. Long after its power fractured, its institutions weakened, and its borders dissolved, the empire continued to function in fragments. Emperors were still crowned. Laws were still issued. Coins still bore imperial faces. To the people living within it, Rome did not feel finished, felt diminished, altered, and strangely familiar. The Western Empire decayed quietly. Cities shrank, trade routes narrowed, infrastructure aged without repair. Authority fragmented among generals, bishops, and local elites. The state still existed on parchment, but daily life was governed by proximity and necessity. Rome was no longer a system. It was a memory. Administrators tried to reenact the East, however, endured. From Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire preserved law, bureaucracy, and imperial identity for nearly 1,000 years. It adapted where the West resisted. It negotiated when it could not dominate. It survived by redefining what Rome meant to less a city, more a tradition of governance. This survival exposed a truth. Rome did not fall everywhere in the same way. What failed in the West was not civilization, but centralization. Power became local. Identity became regional. Authority dispersed among new structures, churches, kingdoms, and feudal bonds. The imperial framework dissolved into something else. Yet Rome's influence did not vanish. Its law became the foundation of future legal systems. Its language evolved into new tongues. Its roads guided medieval trade. Its church carried universal authority where emperors could not. Rome ceased to rule by force, but continued to rule by inheritance. This was Rome's final transformation. An empire built to dominate space evolved into an idea that dominated time. The physical structure decayed, but the conceptual architecture endured. Governance, law, citizenship, and authority across Europe remained Roman at their core even when Rome itself was gone. The paradox was complete. Rome had sought permanence through control. It achieved permanence through dissolution. By outliving itself, it ensured that no successor could fully replace it, only reinterpret it. The empire no longer needed legions. It had become unavoidable. Chapter 8. Rome. The silence after power. When Rome stopped commanding the world, it did not leave emptiness. It left silence. The machinery of empire, dicks, taxes. When that machinery faded, people did not immediately celebrate freedom. They felt disorientation. For generations, meaning had been supplied from above. Now, local communities faced a question they had not asked in centuries. What governs us when empire is gone? In many regions, Roman administration collapsed faster than social habits. People still spoke Latin. They still followed Roman law when possible. They still imagined authority in Roman terms, but the center no longer answered. Orders stopped arriving. Protection vanished unevenly. Power became personal. Silence revealed fragility. Without imperial coordination, long-distance trade withered. Coinage lost trust. Cities depopulated as people returned to land-based survival. Public buildings decayed not from violence, but from neglect. The grandeur of empire turned into ruined structures, too large for local use, too symbolic to ignore. Ruins taught a lesson Rome never intended. They reminded survivors that power is temporary, but consequences endure. Stone outlasted authority. Roads led nowhere. Amphitheaters became quarries. The infrastructure of control became the archaeology of memory. In this vacuum, new authorities emerged. The church expanded not through conquest, but continuity. Where the empire once managed life, the church managed meaning. Bishops replaced governors. Monasteries replaced administrative centers. Faith offered coherence in a fragmented world. It promised order without empire. Kings arose as protectors rather than rulers. Early medieval power was personal, negotiated, and local. Authority depended on loyalty, not law. This was not a regression. it was an adaptation. Large systems had failed. Smaller ones felt safer. Rome's absence forced experimentation, yet the shadow of Rome lingered. Every new authority defined itself in relation to what had been lost. Kings claimed Roman legitimacy. Laws echoed Roman codes. The idea of universal order persisted, even when impossible to realize. Rome remained the standard by which power was measured even in its absence. Silence became inheritance. Rome no longer spoke, but everyone listened. The empire had ended, but its echo shaped centuries. The question was no longer how to rule the world, but whether the world could ever be ruled again in the same way. Chapter 9. Rome. Memory, myth, and the struggle to be Rome. Rome did not disappear when its institutions failed. It transformed into memory. Across Europe and the Mediterranean, Rome became a reference point rather than a reality. People no longer lived under Rome, but after it. In this new age, power did not claim to replace Rome, outright it claimed to restore it. Memory became political currency, and myth became a tool of legitimacy. To rule was to invoke Rome. Kings crowned themselves with Roman titles. Emperors were declared in Rome's name. Laws were written as continuations of Roman tradition, even when their substance differed radically. No authority could present itself as new without appearing illegitimate. Continuity mattered more than innovation. Rome's ghost governed ambition. The idea of the Roman Empire became larger after its fall than it had been during its height. Without the burden of administration, Rome turned into an ideal order without corruption, authority without decay, unity without coercion. Memory stripped away complexity and preserved only grandeur. This myth was powerful and dangerous. It froze political imagination. Rather than asking what governance should become, rulers asked how closely they could resemble a vanished past. Revival replaced reform. Restoration replaced adaptation. The Holy Roman Empire, Byzantium, and countless medieval polities defined themselves as Rome's heirs, even as they contradicted its realities. Being Rome mattered more than understanding it. The Church played a central role in preserving and reshaping this memory. Through scripture, liturgy, and education, it inherited Rome's universal language. Latin became sacred. Roman law became moralized. Authority shifted from emperor to god, but the structure remained imperial. Rome lost its armies. It gained eternity. Education carried the myth further. Scholars preserved Roman texts not as historical artifacts, but as models of truth. Cicero, Virgil, and Justinian shaped thought long after legions vanished. Roman order became intellectual discipline. The past instructed the present. Yet memory also obscured failure. Rome was remembered for stability, not stagnation, for law, not inequality, for unity, not suppression. By forgetting why Rome collapsed, successors repeated its mistakes: centralization without flexibility, authority without purpose, order without meaning. The struggle to be Rome became a struggle against reality. As centuries passed, Europe changed. New economies emerged. New identities formed. The world no longer fit Roman categories. Yet the myth endured, shaping politics, architecture, and ambition. Even revolution defined itself in opposition to Rome rather than escape from it. Rome had achieved its final conquest, not of land, but of imagination. And imagination, once captured, resists release. Chapter 10. Rome. When order became a cage, Rome believed order was salvation. From its earliest days, the city had survived by imposing structure on chaos, law over impulse, discipline over desire, hierarchy over disorder. This instinct carried Rome from a fragile settlement on the Tiber to ruler of the Mediterranean world. Order was not merely a tool of governance, it was Rome's identity. But what begins as protection can become confinement. By the later centuries of the empire, Rome was no longer using order to serve life. Life was being reshaped to serve order. Systems once designed to adapt had hardened into rigid frameworks. Flexibility, once Rome's secret strength, gave way to fear of disruption. Stability became obsession. Imperial administration expanded endlessly. More officials were appointed to supervise fewer people. Tax systems grew complex and punitive, designed to extract revenue from a shrinking base. Professions became hereditary, binding families permanently to roles. The state required farmers to land, soldiers to service, artisans to guilds. Mobility declined. Choice narrowed. Rome preserved society by freezing it. The intention was survival. The result was suffocation. As external pressures mounted, the state demanded more while offering less. Taxes increased as protection weakened. Bureaucracy multiplied as effectiveness declined. Laws grew harsher not because crime rose, but because authority felt threatened. Compliance was enforced, not inspired. Order replaced trust. The economy reflected this decay. Long-distance trade, once vibrant, contracted under heavy regulation and insecurity. Coinage was debased, undermining confidence. Barter returned in places once fully monetized. Wealth concentrated in the hands of those closest to power, while the majority struggled under obligation. Rome still claimed universality, but life became increasingly local and constrained. The military, long Rome's backbone, suffered the same fate. Recruitment grew desperate. Discipline weakened as loyalty shifted from the state to commanders or immediate survival. Mercenary forces filled gaps, loyal only as long as payment continued. The army existed, but its spirit had changed. Force without conviction is temporary. Meanwhile, the ruling class withdrew inward. Senators and elites retreated to fortified estates, distancing themselves from civic responsibility. Public life, once central to Roman identity, lost meaning. Politics became dangerous. Withdrawal felt safer than participation. The social contract unraveled quietly. Religion, which had once offered renewal, now mirrored imperial rigidity. Orthodoxy hardened. Dissent became heresy. Faith, institutionalized, struggled to address suffering it could no longer alleviate. Instead of providing transformation, it reinforced hierarchy and obedience. Order invaded belief itself. The tragedy was not cruelty, was exhaustion. Rome was not violently tyrannical in its final centuries. It was tired. Its systems demanded constant maintenance without offering renewal. Every reform attempted to preserve the past rather than imagine the future. The empire could no longer change direction. It could only tighten its grip. This rigidity accelerated fragmentation. Provinces adapted independently. Local leaders made pragmatic decisions without waiting for imperial approval. Loyalty became conditional. Rome still issued commands, but fewer listened. Collapse did not arrive as apocalypse. It arrived as irrelevant. The state continued to exist, but people learned to live around it rather than within it. Authority faded from daily experience. Rome remained a name, a memory, a reference, but no longer a force shaping life's direction. Order, once Rome's salvation, had become its cage. The lesson was brutal and enduring. A system that prioritizes preservation over purpose eventually preserves nothing. Rome had mastered the art of control. What it never mastered was letting go. Chapter 11. Rome. The long goodbye to Empire. Rome did not realize it was saying goodbye. Empires rarely do. There was no final decree announcing the end of Roman authority. No moment when the world collectively agreed that Rome was finished. Instead, the empire dissolved through a prolonged process of disengagement between rulers and subjects, center and periphery, power and belief. What ended Rome was not collapse, but detachment. The empire continued to exist on paper long after it ceased to function in practice. In the West, imperial offices remained, but their authority was increasingly symbolic. Emperors were crowned without armies, laws issued without enforcement, taxes demanded without expectation of compliance. Real power lay with those who could protect people, immediately local warlords, bishops, landowners, and kings who ruled not through universal claims, but through proximity. Rome still spoke, few listened. The concept of empire had become too large for reality to sustain. Communication was slow, resources were uneven, threats were localized. Decisions made at the center arrived too late, misunderstood, or irrelevant. The idea of universal rule, once Rome's greatest innovation, became its most impractical burden. Scale defeated coherence. In response, people adapted pragmatically. Communities stopped waiting for Rome. They repaired roads themselves, negotiated with nearby powers, defended their own territories. Loyalty shifted from abstraction to survival. Rome was no longer the guarantor of order, it was an echo of a system that once had been. This shift did not feel like betrayal. It felt necessary. Even language reflected the change. Latin fragmented into regional dialects. Law became customary rather than codified. Identity narrowed. People stopped calling themselves Romans in the political sense and began defining themselves by land, lord, or faith. Rome's universality gave way to particularity. Yet, paradoxically, Rome's prestige increased as its authority faded. The idea of Rome became sacred precisely because it was unreachable. No living ruler could fully embody it. To claim Roman legacy was to claim legitimacy beyond force. Rome became a moral reference rather than a governing reality. This transformation culminated quietly in 476 CE. The deposition of the last Western Roman emperor did not shock contemporaries. There were no riots, no collective mourning. Authority had already moved elsewhere. What ended was not empire, but the illusion that empire still mattered. The world went on. In the East, however, Rome endured differently. Constantinople preserved imperial structure, law, and ritual. The Byzantine emperors considered themselves Romans not in name, but in function. Their survival demonstrated that Rome's decline was not inevitably, was contextual. But even the East could not escape transformation. As centuries passed, the Eastern Empire adapted, negotiated, and redefined itself. Greek replaced Latin. Christianity reshaped governance. Rome lived, but it was no longer the Rome that conquered the Mediterranean. It was something else, shaped by compromise and endurance. Rome did not die. It changed beyond recognition. The long goodbye to empire was not tragic. It was instructive. Rome revealed that no system, however powerful, can remain universal forever. Authority must shrink or adapt. When scale outpaces meaning, withdrawal becomes rational. People do not abandon systems because they hate them, but because they no longer need them. The end of Rome was not the triumph of chaos. It was the acceptance of limits. What followed was not darkness, but plurality. Many centers replaced one. Many identities replaced one identity. The world became smaller, more fragmented, and more human in scale. Rome had sought to rule everything. In the end, it taught humanity that nothing can. The empire's final legacy was not its fall, but the realization that permanence is an illusion, and that power, when stretched too far, dissolves into memory. Rome's goodbye was long, quiet, and irreversible, and it prepared the world for something new. Chapter 12. Rome, what remains when power is gone? When Rome finally released its grip on the world, it left behind more than ruins. It left behind a question that no civilization has ever fully answered. What endures when power disappears? Empires are measured by territory, armies, and wealth while they exist. After they fade, they are measured by influence, by what survives them. In this sense, Rome never truly vanished. It dispersed, stone by stone, idea by idea. The physical remnants were the most visible. Roads still guided travel centuries after legions withdrew. Aqueducts continued to deliver water to cities long stripped of imperial authority. Law codes were copied, interpreted, and enforced by powers that no longer called themselves Roman. These structures outlived the political will that created them. But infrastructure alone does not explain Rome's endurance. What truly survived was a way of thinking about power. Rome taught the world that authority could be abstract, institutional, and impersonal. Power did not have to reside in a single ruler's charisma or divine claim. It could exist in offices, procedures, and systems. Even when emperors vanished, the idea of governance through law remained compelling. Future kingdoms adopted Roman concepts instinctively. They wrote laws, they minted coins, they built capitals modeled on Rome. They sought legitimacy, not merely through force, but through continuity. To rule well was to rule as Rome once did Devon, if imperfectly. Yet Rome's legacy was not purely constructive. It also transmitted cautionary lessons. Rome demonstrated that scale carries consequences, that systems optimized for control can lose responsiveness, that order, when elevated above meaning, becomes hollow, that power sustained without purpose erodes trust rather than earning loyalty. Later, civilizations inherited Rome's structures, but also its blind spots. The modern world, too, is Roman in its contradictions. States governed by law, bureaucracies spanning continents, professional armies, citizenship defined by rights and obligations, infrastructure binding distant regions together. These are Roman solutions to human problems. They persist because they work. But Rome's shadow also lingers in overreach, in institutions that grow too complex to understand, in authority that demands compliance without offering purpose, in systems that preserve themselves while forgetting whom they serve. Rome reminds us that efficiency is not wisdom, and longevity is not legitimacy. Even Rome's fall left a pattern. Its fragmentation taught humanity that collapse does not always mean annihilation. It can mean transformation. The end of one universal order allowed many local ones to emerge. Creativity followed where uniformity had dominated. Diversity replaced singular control. From Rome's absence came new beginnings. Language evolved, cultures blended, identities multiplied. The world became less centralized, but more adaptive. Rome's failure to contain everything allowed history to move forward. In this way, Rome's greatest contribution may have been unintentional. It showed that no system, however brilliant, can remain absolute, that endurance requires renewal, that power must justify itself continuously or fade into irrelevance. Rome tried to make permanence through control. It achieved permanence through influence. The empire no longer rules maps, but it rules concepts. Law, governance, citizenship, and authority still speak in Roman terms even when Rome itself is forgotten. We live not in Rome's territory, but in its aftermath, and that is Rome's final lesson. Power ends, consequences remain. Civilizations are not immortal, but their choices echo long after their banners fall. Rome's echo has lasted millennia, not because it was flawless, but because it confronted humanity with its own ambitions and limits. Rome did not conquer eternity, it shaped it. Rome never learned how to end, it only learned how to endure, and itself became a habit without direction. When the legions vanished and the banners fell, Rome did not leave behind a vacuum. It left behind a framework for how humans imagine order. Long after emperors disappeared, people still argued in Roman terms. Law versus chaos, authority versus freedom, unity versus fragmentation. Even rebellion defined itself against Roman logic. Rome became the measure of what power should look like. This was its final paradox. A civilization that failed to preserve itself became the template for all who followed. Kingdoms rose, claiming Roman legacy. Churches adopted Roman structure. Modern states inherited Roman bureaucracy, law, and territorial thinking, often without remembering their origin. Rome lost its body. It kept its skeleton, yet history has not stopped testing Rome's lessons. Every age that seeks total order risks repeating Rome's era, confusing control with purpose. Every system that values stability above meaning walks the same narrowing path Rome once followed. The empire's story is not ancient, it is recurring. Rome warns without speaking. It reminds us that power must justify itself, not merely maintain itself. That systems must serve life, not trap it. That endurance without renewal becomes decay, disguised as strength. Rome fell not because humans are weak, but because humans change. And change is the one force no empire can permanently command. Rome's eagles no longer fly, but their shadow still moves across history. The question Rome leaves behind is not how great it was, but whether we have learned anything from it.